Just as he reached for the ring, a 10-year-old girl burst in and screamed, "Stop the wedding, he's my dad and no one here knows the truth." On a warm spring afternoon, the grand ballroom of the Prescott estate shimmered with crystal chandeliers and whispered anticipation. Today was to be a perfect day. Alexander Prescott, the brilliant CEO and heir to one of the most powerful pharmaceutical empires in the country, was about to marry Rachel Whitmore, a poised and ambitious woman whose pedigree matched his own. Guests in designer gowns and tailored suits watched with bated breath as the orchestra swelled and the bride began her graceful walk down the aisle. But just before she reached the altar, the room froze. A small girl no older than 10 walked barefoot down the center aisle in a simple white dress, her eyes steady and full of a sorrow far too old for her age. Her voice cut through the silence, delicate yet unwavering. "My name is Nadia. I'm not here to celebrate a wedding. I came to ask if you remember the little girl you left behind." The moment shattered everything Alexander thought he knew about his past, his future, and the truth buried in the heart of the woman he was about to marry. The Prescott estate had never looked more opulent. Golden drapes shimmered in the afternoon light that poured through the cathedral-sized windows, casting a soft glow on the marble floors and perfectly arranged rows of white roses. Guests in sleek black tuxedos and glittering gowns sipped champagne, their eyes fixed on the grand staircase where Alexander Prescott, the media-shy, brilliant CEO of Prescott Pharma, stood with quiet confidence. His tailored suit was flawless, his expression unreadable as always. Beside him stood Rachel Whitmore, radiant in a custom Vera Wang gown, her every movement poised and calculated. She had spent her entire life climbing to this moment, marrying into the most powerful pharmaceutical dynasty in the country. The ceremony was set to be the merger of two titans, an empire built on science and another on image. The media had been barred for privacy, but whispers of the union had already sent stock prices soaring. String instruments played softly as Rachel descended the aisle, her smile subtle, rehearsed perfect. Every eye was on her. Every flash of crystal and sparkle of silk screamed perfection. It was the wedding of the year until a small barefoot girl appeared at the entrance, her simple white dress fluttering in the breeze, her presence so out of place it made the entire room stop breathing. The music didn't stop, but it faltered. A single violin note cracked just slightly enough to draw a few curious glances toward the grand entrance of the ballroom. At first, no one quite registered what they were seeing. The sunlight behind her made it hard to make out her face, but as she stepped into the center aisle, it became painfully clear: a little girl, maybe 10 years old, barefoot, wearing a simple white cotton dress that barely brushed her knees. Her hair was long and wild curls, framing a face that was strikingly out of place in a room filled with couture and diamonds. The hush that fell over the guests was unnatural heavy. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Heads turned. The orchestra stopped entirely, the last note hanging in the air like a question. At the altar, Alexander's breath caught in his throat as he instinctively stepped forward, confusion creasing his otherwise polished expression. Rachel stiffened beside him, her jaw tightening. The girl's feet were dusty, her dress slightly wrinkled, but her eyes, those eyes were unshakably steady, full of something ancient. She walked slowly, deliberately down the aisle, meant for a bride, not a child, as if she had every right to be there. No one moved. It was as if the room collectively forgot how to breathe. She stopped. Midway, turned toward the crowd and spoke not with the high-pitched voice of a child, but with a quiet, deliberate calm that made the hairs on everyone's arms rise. "My name is Nadia," she said, her voice echoing through the ballroom like a ripple in still water. "I'm not here to stop a wedding. I just need to know if the man standing up there remembers the girl he left behind." Murmurs erupted, a mix of disbelief and stunned curiosity. Alexander's face drained of color, his mouth opening slightly as if to respond, but unable to produce sound. Rachel reached for his arm, but he didn't notice. He was staring at the girl with an intensity that no one could understand except perhaps Rachel, whose hand began to tremble as she realized this moment, this child could dismantle everything. The girl didn't cry, didn't yell, She simply looked up at Alexander with the heartbreaking honesty of someone too young to understand how much damage truth could do and too brave to care. A guest in the third row whispered, "Is that his daughter?" And the ripple turned into a wave. Cameras that had been tucked away suddenly came out, phones raised under the guise of curiosity. A few older guests gasped. Someone from the staff moved forward to intervene, but Alexander raised his hand without taking his eyes off the girl. "Wait," he said, barely more than a whisper. The girl turned back toward him, and for the briefest moment it was as if no one else existed. Her eyes shimmered but didn't break. She took one more step forward, then stopped. "You don't have to say anything," she said, voice trembling now for the first time, "but I found the picture and the letter, and I just needed to know if I mattered to you at all." The words landed like a thunderclap, not loud but irreversible. Alexander's chest rose and fell unevenly. Rachel stepped back, her eyes wide, calculating. The silence that followed was suffocating. In a room built for power and perfection, a barefoot girl with dust on her toes had just shattered the illusion of control, with nothing but her presence and a question no one could answer. The silence in the ballroom deepened into something almost sacred, as if time itself had been arrested by the weight of a single child's presence. Nadia stood still, her bare feet rooted to the marble like an ancient truth rising from the floor itself. The ornate chandeliers above flickered slightly, though no one could tell if it was the light or their own breathless tension that made the room feel dimmer. She looked so small, framed by a cathedral of opulence, white roses, polished crystal, the soft golden hue of wealth etched into every surface. But her voice, when it came, sliced through all of it like a blade. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. But the power of her words cracked the silence like glass. "My name is Nadia. My mother's name is Rachel. But I didn't come to celebrate a wedding. I came to ask, do you remember who you left behind?" The gasp that tore through the guests was instinctive, raw, almost primal. People turned to each other in disbelief, jaws, slack fingers clutching pearls or cufflinks or champagne flutes now trembling in the air. Rachel, standing at the altar in her custom silk gown, turned pale, her body going rigid. Her eyes widened, her perfectly poised lips parting just slightly as if she'd been struck. Alexander didn't speak. He couldn't. His entire body swayed as if the words had unmoored something deep inside him. He stared at the child as though seeing a ghost, or worse, a truth he had spent 10 years trying to bury. Nadia didn't blink. Her voice held steady, but the slight tremor beneath it betrayed the storm churning inside. "You were supposed to be gone that night, but you came back. And you heard her crying. My mom, she told me. You left anyway." Her gaze locked with Alexander's. "You walked out the door, and you never came back." One by one, the pieces began to fall into place in the minds of those watching. The name, the resemblance, the timing. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. A man from the board of directors leaned forward, whispering to his wife. Rachel had a baby. But it wasn't gossip anymore. It was a reckoning. Alexander tried to speak, tried to summon something that would explain excuse, contain the explosion that had just been detonated in the most public moment of his life. But the words failed. His eyes moved to Rachel, searching, almost pleading. She took a single step back. "You told me she was adopted out," he murmured, voice cracking. "You said there was no child." Rachel's hands were shaking now, her perfect image dissolving before 100 pairs of eyes. "She wasn't supposed to know," she whispered. "You weren't supposed to know." Nadia looked between them, her face pale but defiant. "I wasn't supposed to exist, was I?" The words landed like a final strike. There was no coming back from them. The fairy tale wedding had turned into a public unraveling of lies, love, betrayal, and the child no one expected to stand there and tell the truth. "I don't want money," Nadia said quietly, her voice soft but carrying. "I just wanted to know if you remember, if you regret it, if you ever think about the girl you left behind." A single tear rolled down Alexander's cheek. Rachel said nothing. The guests sat frozen, caught between horror and heartbreak. And in that moment, in a room gilded with power and drenched in silence, the real story began not of a perfect union, but of a fractured past, a hidden child, and the cost of secrets too long kept buried. For a long, suspended moment, no one in the ballroom dared to move. The air felt thick, as if the atmosphere itself had curdled under the weight of Nadia's words. Forks hovered inches from plates, champagne flutes trembled in still hands, and the orchestra sat paralyzed, their instruments silent and useless. It was as though every guest, every soul in the room had simultaneously forgotten how to breathe. Alexander stood frozen at the altar, staring at the girl who had just shattered the foundation of the life he had so meticulously built. His hands, usually so controlled, so steady in every boardroom and crisis, now hung helplessly by his sides. The color had drained from his face, his lips slightly parted, but no words came. He wasn't just shocked, he was gutted, stripped, unmade. Rachel, too, had gone completely still. Her bridal bouquet slipped slightly in her grip knuckles, white against the stems. Her back was rigid, her face an eerie mix of fury, fear, and disbelief. She couldn't even look at Alexander. Her eyes were locked on Nadia, the girl she had worked so hard to erase from this day, from this life. The silence was so complete that even the chandeliers seemed to hum in tension, waiting for something, anything, to break the unbearable stillness. But nothing did. Not yet. The weight of the truth pressed down on everyone in the room. No one whispered. No one dared ask a question. Every guest understood instinctively that they were no longer spectators at a wedding, but witnesses to a reckoning. Alexander's chest rose and fell, shallow and uneven. He looked again at Nadia, and in that look was the first crack in the image he had worn for years. The polished, untouchable man now crumbling before a child who had asked the only question that mattered. Do you remember who you left behind? 10 years earlier, the world was a very different place for Rachel Whitmore. She was not yet the poised, high-profile communications executive whose image graced magazine covers and whose every move was calculated to climb. Back then she was ambitious, yes, but still navigating the sharp turns of corporate ascent, still finding the pressure points of powerful men and mastering how to press them just right. That business trip with Alexander Prescott had been unexpected, improvised by circumstance, when the lead strategist fell ill and Rachel, hungry for an opportunity, stepped in. Over late nights reviewing data and sharing private frustrations about legacy and loneliness, something fragile bloomed between them, something unspoken and sharp-edged. And one night in a quiet hotel suite in Geneva, it crossed a line. She hadn't meant for it to happen. Neither had he. There were no promises made, no morning-after declarations. Just a lingering silence followed by a quick return to their respective roles. Alexander returned to his boardrooms and billion-dollar negotiations. Rachel returned to her carefully measured ascent, filing the night away as an anomaly, until 6 weeks later when the nausea began, when the tests turned positive, when the reality hit. Rachel was pregnant with the child of the most powerful man in the pharmaceutical world, and instead of fear, what she felt was strategy. She didn't tell him, not a word, not because she was afraid of him, but because she wasn't ready to let this child become a distraction, or worse, a liability. Rachel didn't see a baby. She saw leverage. She saw a living wild card she wasn't ready to play. So she hid the pregnancy. She quietly moved cities, arranged private medical care, and built a narrative around a sabbatical for personal development. No one questioned her. She was brilliant, disciplined, relentless. When the child, a girl, was born, Rachel didn't cry. She didn't hold the baby for long. She didn't choose a name, only allowed the nurses to mark her as N for now. And within 48 hours, Rachel handed the infant to a carefully vetted nanny and left. No goodbye. No maternal guilt. Just a signed check, a list of instructions, and a non-disclosure agreement. Rachel told herself it was temporary, that once she had secured her position, once she had built enough power to use the child as an asset, and not a risk, she would reappear. But weeks became months, and the months became years. She climbed faster than she imagined, secured contracts, graced panels, attracted media. And all the while she made one calculated decision after another to keep the child in the shadows. Not abandoned, not exactly, but deferred. The nanny reported back regularly, photos, updates, milestones. Rachel read the reports like business memos assessing progress without attachment. The child, she was told, was bright, observant, quiet. But Rachel never visited. She had crafted a future too perfectly to risk it unraveling. And when the whispers began about Alexander's company seeking a new head of global strategy, someone who could merge both brand and policy, Rachel returned to the capital perfectly timed and perfectly packaged. She knew exactly how to make him look at her again, how to become indispensable. She didn't think about the girl with the wide eyes and silent questions. Not really, because in Rachel's mind, everything had a place, even her daughter. She was not cruel, at least not intentionally. She had simply filed motherhood under later, but some truths refuse to stay shelved. Some children learn how to find their way back. And some ghosts wear white dresses and walk into weddings not to destroy but to be seen. Alexander grabbed Rachel's wrist the moment the first whispers started rising in the stunned ballroom. His grip firm but not violent, just urgent burning. He didn't look at anyone as he led her through the heavy curtains at the back of the aisle, away from the frozen guests, the blinking chandelier lights, and the wide-eyed child standing at the center of a storm she'd just unleashed. Behind the silk panels and into the narrow hallway where catering trays sat untouched, Alexander finally turned to face her, and his voice came low, jagged, breaking through the carefully preserved veneer of control he always wore. "Tell me who she is," he said, barely managing to hold the words together. Rachel tried to speak to twist the moment back under her narrative, but Alexander wasn't listening, not this time. "Is she mine?" he asked, and though his voice didn't rise, it thundered with betrayal. Rachel's silence gave him the answer before her lips did, the way her eyes darted the flicker of calculation trying to reset. "You knew," he said, the words tasting like ash. "You knew for 10 years, and you said nothing. You stood beside me, slept beside me, built this entire future while your daughter grew up without a father. Without me?" His breath was short, not from rage, but from something deeper, older, like the floor beneath his entire identity had given way. And all Rachel could do was stand there still in white, but exposed in ways she never imagined. Alexander stood tall but trembling, his breath unsteady, the silence between them electric and about to detonate. His voice cracked, first low and furious, the words erupting from a place deeper than anger, betrayal layered with heartbreak. "Is she mine?" he asked again, more directly this time, his jaw tight, his eyes searching her face for a sliver of denial, of logic, of mercy. Rachel didn't blink. "Yes," she said flatly. No tears, no theatrics. Just fact. "Her name is Nadia." Alexander inhaled sharply, staggered by the confirmation, a tidal wave crashing into him without warning. His next words came bitter, burning. "Why, Rachel? Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't I know I had a daughter walking this earth for 10 years? Why did she have to tell me in front of hundreds of people at our damn wedding?" Rachel's lip twitched, not from guilt, but from restraint. "Because I didn't need your permission to live my life." She snapped, her tone sharpening like a blade. "I made a decision for myself, for my future, and I don't regret it. You didn't need my permission." He echoed in disbelief, stepping closer. "That's not what this is about, and you know it. This isn't about you needing me. It's about Nadia needing me. It's about what you stole from both of us." Rachel crossed her arms, defensive now. Her eyes narrowed and calculating. "I didn't steal anything. I protected her from uncertainty, from chaos, from becoming a pawn in your empire, or worse, your weakness. I did what I had to do." "You hid her," Alexander shouted, now voice reverberating off the empty corridor. "You made a decision that was never yours alone. I had a right to know. I had a right to choose." Rachel's mouth tightened. "No, you had a right to dominate, and I wasn't going to let you control me or her. I watched you ruin people, Alexander. I watched the way your family consumed everything it touched. I didn't want that for her. Then you should have trusted me to decide what kind of father I could be." He fired back, eyes blazing. You made me a liar before I even knew I was one. Do you know how many times I've stood in front of shareholders, the media, my own conscience defending who I am, and all this time my own daughter thought I abandoned her?" Rachel's voice dipped colder. "Don't turn this into your redemption story. You didn't know, because you didn't need to know not back then. I wasn't going to chain my future to yours with a baby you didn't ask for." "She's not a chain," Alexander growled, stepping so close they could hear each other's heartbeats. "She's a person. She's my daughter. And now she's out there, humiliated, confused, and braver than either of us because she stood up and demanded the truth while we both hid behind our images." Rachel faltered just slightly, the first crack surfacing in her perfectly controlled expression. "She wasn't supposed to be here," she murmured. "No," Alexander said, voice hollow. "But she is, and nothing about us will ever be the same again." As Rachel's words hung in the air like smoke refusing to clear, Alexander felt his heart pound not just with rage or betrayal, but with something more insidious doubt. A gnawing, spiraling uncertainty began to curl through his gut, twisting tighter with every breath. His mind, always sharp, analytical, able to dissect billion-dollar mergers in seconds, was now clouded by one unbearable question. What if she's not mine? He replayed Nadia's face in his head, her eyes the way they narrowed with focus. Her jaw when she spoke with that fearless clarity, her stance vulnerable, yet defiant. Was there something of him in that, or was he just projecting what he wanted to see? She looked nothing like Rachel. That much was obvious. Her curls were darker, her skin warmer, her features less pristine than the woman in front of him. He tried to conjure a memory of 10 years ago, that business trip, the night they'd spent together, the details Rachel had hidden like state secrets. But all he had now were fragments, and Rachel's timing suddenly felt too perfect, too calculated. Was this a ploy? A manipulation? A strategic grenade thrown into the middle of a high-stakes wedding for some undisclosed gain? He staggered a step back, reeling inside. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "You say she's mine." But how do I know? Rachel's face froze. And for the first time since the ceremony unraveled, a sliver of uncertainty flickered in her eyes, not fear, not guilt, but something more dangerous, control slipping. And in that terrifying, unraveling moment, Alexander wasn't just doubting her. He was doubting everything. Just as the silence in the wedding hall teetered on the edge of collapse, held together by the stunned stares of guests and the fraying composure of the bride and groom, a chair scraped sharply across the marble floor. Heads turned, as a woman stood not with hesitation, but with the calm precision of someone who knew this moment would come. She was in her mid-40s with soft lines around her eyes that spoke more of sleepless nights than age, her dark navy dress modest, but dignified, her posture unwavering. Her name was Grace Holloway, though few in this glittering crowd of socialites, politicians, and shareholders knew her. She had not come to celebrate the wedding. She had come for the girl. "My name is Grace," she said, her voice cutting through the air like silk against steel. "I'm Nadia's legal guardian, her mother in all but blood." The room shifted, curiosity crackling into confusion. Alexander turned sharply, his eyes narrowing as he took in the stranger who suddenly held part of the story no one else could tell. Rachel's face paled, her jaw tightening ever so slightly. Grace stepped forward, slow and measured, never once looking at Rachel, her gaze fixed on Alexander. "I raised her. From the moment she was born and handed to me, swaddled, silent, forgotten, I have been the one who fed her, who held her through fevers, who taught her to read, to tie her shoes, to speak with dignity, even when no one listened. Nadia is smart, brave, and heartbreakingly aware of the silence she grew up in." Her voice trembled only once when she said the girl's name, then steadied again. "She always asked about you." She never said it angrily, only curiously. "Who is he? Does he know I exist? Did he choose to leave?" Grace inhaled deeply, then added more gently, "Now, she came here today not to ruin your wedding, Mr. Prescott. She came because she couldn't carry the weight of being invisible anymore." A breathless stillness fell again, not the silence of confusion this time, but of something deeper recognition. This woman, quiet and uninvited, had just handed Alexander the full weight of a decade, and the undeniable truth that Nadia had not been dropped into his life by accident but had been walking toward this moment her whole life. Grace's voice softened, but her words did not lose their weight. "I was a nanny." Once she began her gaze unwavering as she addressed the man who until moments ago stood at the center of a fairy tale wedding. 10 years ago I worked for Rachel. I had been hired to care for her home, keep things quiet, while she prepared for what she said was the most important career leap of her life. I didn't ask questions. I never imagined that one day she would hand me a child and walk away. But that's what she did. One rainy morning, she placed a newborn in my arms. No name, no birth certificate, just a small silver bracelet with the letter N. She looked me in the eye and said, "You know what to do." And then she disappeared. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and no one came back. Grace's throat tightened, but she pressed on. I waited, I called, I wrote letters I never sent, thinking maybe she was sick, maybe she'd been delayed. But deep down, I knew. Rachel never planned to return. She treated Nadia like an inconvenience, like a liability to be shelved. But to me, she was never that. I didn't know what I was doing at first. I was a woman with no children of her own, a nanny turned mother overnight. But I learned. I stayed up through the colic, held her hand through every scraped knee, read every bedtime story twice when she couldn't sleep. I gave her a birthday when no one remembered, a Christmas tree when no one else came, and a name, Nadia, because a child without a name is a child without a beginning. I enrolled her in school. I taught her to stand up straight even when the world tried to bend her down. She didn't ask about her mother at first, but by age 5 she started noticing. Other kids had photos, stories, fathers who picked them up after school. Nadia had me. She never complained. She never blamed. But I saw it, the ache for answers, the hope that maybe one day someone would claim her, not out of duty, but out of love. Grace looked directly at Alexander, now her voice low but clear. "She's not here to destroy anything. She's here to know if you're the man she's imagined every night before sleep, or just another name she'll have to learn to forget." It wasn't a DNA test or some dramatic confession that led Nadia to the truth. It was a photograph, worn and faded, buried beneath the lining of an old jewelry box, and a letter that had slipped behind a drawer long forgotten. Grace had kept the box tucked away in the back of a closet, filled with the few remnants from the day Rachel handed the baby over and vanished. Nadia had stumbled upon it by accident while looking for art supplies one rainy afternoon, years after she had stopped asking questions out loud, but never stopped wondering. The photo was small, creased at the corners, showing a man in a suit with piercing eyes and a half smile standing beside a young Rachel in what looked like a hotel conference room. At first, it meant nothing to Nadia, just another adult face from a life she had never known. But when she turned the photo over, written in sharp black ink were 5 words, A. Prescott, she'll never know. It meant little on its own until she found the letter wedged behind the drawer's back panel. It wasn't long, just a few rushed lines scribbled on monogrammed paper, addressed to G. Rachel's handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, slanted, and cold. "If anything ever happens, you know where to go. He'll never claim her. His name is Alexander Prescott. She wasn't part of the plan. She's mine now. Keep her quiet." Nadia's fingers trembled as she read it, her breath catching not from sadness, but from something heavier, recognition. She had a name now, a reason, a direction. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She simply folded the letter, tucked it inside her pillowcase that night, and began to plan. For weeks, she watched videos of Alexander online, learning his cadence, the way he spoke at tech summits, how his smile faded when no one was looking. She memorized the details of his world, the towering buildings, the polished speeches, the glamorous fiancé. It wasn't resentment that fueled her, but resolve. A need to be seen, to ask the question that had haunted her for years. If you knew about me, would you have come? She didn't tell Grace, not right away. Not until the day she stood outside the towering venue in a simple white dress, barefoot, clutching the photo and letter like they were armor. She knew she wasn't supposed to be there. She knew this was his big day. But she also knew the truth now, and it was time he did too. Nadia hadn't come to destroy a wedding, ruin reputations, or demand money from the man everyone called a genius billionaire. She came for something far simpler, far more human. She came with a question too big for a 10-year-old heart to carry alone, and yet she had carried it for as long as she could remember. Her purpose wasn't revenge, it wasn't even justice. It was clarity, truth, the kind of truth that could either shatter a child or set her free. She didn't need headlines or lawyers or bank accounts. What she needed was to look into the eyes of the man whose blood ran through hers and ask him not as a stranger, but as a daughter, was I abandoned or just forgotten? There's a difference, and Nadia knew it. One meant she was discarded, deliberately left behind. The other meant she simply never mattered enough to be remembered. And somehow, to her, being forgotten hurt more. Forgotten meant she never even made a dent in his life, never existed in his memory. Forgotten meant she wasn't even worth the pain of being missed. So she stood there, small but unshaken, in a sea of shocked adults, and stiff silence, not for drama, but for truth. Every step she had taken barefoot through the marble halls of that opulent wedding venue had been filled with purpose. She wasn't here to accuse. She wasn't here to cry. She came to be seen, to be heard, and maybe, just maybe, to be claimed. For years she had asked herself in silence why no one came, why birthdays passed like regular days, why no one ever looked for her. Grace had loved her fiercely, raised her with warmth and books and lullabies, but even that love could not erase the question that lingered every night before sleep. Who left me? Why, and do they ever think of me now? As the man in the expensive tuxedo stood frozen before her, surrounded by stunned guests and a bride too shocked to speak. Nadia's voice was calm, not trembling, not angry, just steady, because her heart had already lived through the pain. What she needed now was the truth. She didn't want to live her whole life wondering whether her very existence had been a mistake, swept under a rug of corporate power and strategic silence. She wasn't here for pity, and she wasn't a pawn. She had seen enough of the world to know it wouldn't hand her closure unless she demanded it. So, with the eyes of the room locked on her and the truth burning in her chest like a secret long overdue, she asked, not to shame, not to punish, but to understand, did you leave me behind? Or did you never even know I existed? Alexander stood completely still, as if the question had turned his entire body to stone. Around him the world didn't just quiet, it collapsed into silence so thick it felt like a vacuum, swallowing every gasp, every whisper, every unspoken thought. And yet, through that unbearable stillness, it was Nadia's eyes that pierced everything. They weren't wide with fear or trembling with emotion like one might expect from a child standing alone in a room full of stunned adults. No, they were calm, steady. The kind of eyes that had been forced to grow up too soon, not because of trauma loud enough to be noticed, but because of an absence so quiet it went undetected. Alexander looked at her and felt something inside him rupture, not violently but quietly, in the way a fault line shifts before the quake is ever felt. She looked nothing like him, and yet something in her expression, maybe the tilt of her chin, maybe the weight of her stare, was achingly familiar. And in that moment he realized this wasn't just about her. This was about him too. The life he thought he had mastered, the narrative he believed was clean, was now cracked wide open by a child who had not asked for revenge, but recognition. A child who had walked barefoot into a palace of power and demanded nothing but truth. And what stunned the room wasn't the fact that she might be his daughter. It was that she didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply stood there, her gaze unyielding, asking a man who had conquered industries, commanded boardrooms, and controlled empires to answer a question that no amount of money could deflect. Was I ever yours? The air shifted. Some guests turned their eyes away, unable to bear the quiet indictment. Others watched, transfixed by the rawness of it all, of a truth that couldn't be dressed in PR or softened by charity. Rachel stood pale, unmoving, but it was Alexander who bore the full weight of those eyes. He felt the years he had lived collapse into themselves. He thought of every board meeting, every deal, every night. He convinced himself he was building a legacy and realized that somewhere without his knowledge, a deeper legacy had already been written in silence. Nadia's silence. Her strength wasn't loud, but it demanded to be felt. And in that gaze, she did more than accuse, she humanized him. She reduced him from mogul to man, from powerful to accountable. And he had no script for this, no reply crafted by speechwriters or legal counsel. There was no contract to sign, no donation to offer, no exit plan. There was only her. And for the first time in his adult life, Alexander Whitmore didn't know what to say, because the most powerful man in the room had just been asked the simplest question by the smallest person present, and he had no answer. Only silence. Alexander stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, the chaos of the wedding around him reduced to white noise, muffled by the weight of one child's eyes. Nadia didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't blink. Her presence was disarming, not because she screamed or demanded anything, but because she didn't. She just stood there, still waiting, not like a girl with a tantrum, but like someone who had already grown used to disappointment and silence. The room held its breath, but Alexander felt his own lungs tighten for a different reason. There had been many boardrooms, many crises, many moments in his billion-dollar career that demanded swift action, but none had ever undone him like this. None had ever looked at him with eyes that mirrored his own. The tremor that ran through him wasn't fear, it was recognition. Without thinking, without regard for the stunned crowd, the cameras or the woman in the wedding dress beside him, Alexander stepped forward and slowly knelt down until his eyes were level with Nadia's. His tuxedo crumpled against the marble floor, but he didn't care. In this moment, power, wealth, legacy, none of it mattered. Only this small girl with bare feet and a voice strong enough to rupture everything he thought he knew. He looked at her not as a CEO, not as a groom, not as a man whose world was unraveling in public, but as something far more terrifying, as a father. And not a father who had raised her or even known her, but a father facing the possibility that he had missed the most important decade of someone's life. He didn't offer apologies, not yet. He didn't rush to claim her or defend himself or plead ignorance. Instead, he asked the only question that truly mattered, his voice, low, steady, and almost reverent. "What do you want from me?" The question wasn't cynical. It wasn't cold. It wasn't a negotiation. It was raw, honest, unshielded. He wasn't asking what she wanted from his money or his name or his world. He was asking what she needed from him. Because the truth was, he didn't know. He didn't know what to give, what to say, what to feel. All he knew was that somehow this child, this impossible, barefoot, beautiful child, had cracked open a part of him that he didn't even know had been sealed shut. She had come not with accusation, but with a question. And now he had one of his own, not to buy her silence or earn redemption, but because for the first time in his life someone was looking at him not for his empire, but for who he might have been to them. A father. And that scared him more than anything. The air around them seemed to still as Alexander's question hung in the space between father and daughter, quiet, yet echoing louder than any of the whispers rippling through the wedding hall. Nadia stood motionless for a beat, as if letting the weight of the moment settle, as if considering the question, not like a child looking for a favor, but like someone who had rehearsed this encounter 1,000 times in the quiet of her own heart. Her hand, still clutching the hem of her worn white dress, trembled slightly, not out of fear, but from the unspeakable pressure of holding in years of wondering, of waiting, of longing. She looked at him, not the man in the tuxedo, not the billionaire everyone whispered about, not the stranger whose name she had only read on articles and watched on screens, but simply deeply like a daughter looking at her father. And then, with a voice so soft, it felt like it might disappear. If not listened to carefully enough, she whispered, "I don't need anything. I just want to hug my dad. Just once." Her words didn't explode. They didn't demand. They didn't even accuse. But they broke something in everyone who heard them. A woman gasped near the altar. Someone in the front row reached for tissues. Even Rachel, still standing with her bouquet lowered, could not look away. It wasn't the request that undid them. It was the simplicity. In a world of contracts and inheritances and broken promises and lavish ceremonies, here was a child who had traveled through uncertainty and silence, not to claim a title or fortune, but to ask for something so basic, so human, so heartbreakingly pure to be held. Just once. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. Of all the possible answers, he hadn't expected this one. He would have been prepared for demands for tears, for accusations about abandonment or resentment. But he wasn't prepared for mercy. He wasn't prepared for grace. He wasn't prepared for a girl who had every right to scream, but chose instead to offer peace. A single hug. That's all she asked for. And in that moment, everything he thought mattered about legacy reputation control fell away. What use was power if it couldn't make up for a decade of absence? What use was money if it couldn't buy back the first time your daughter called you dad? He looked at her, his throat burning, and for the first time since kneeling down, his hands moved, not in hesitation, not in self-defense, but open, waiting, not pulling her in, but inviting her, giving her the choice. And then she stepped forward, slowly, carefully, and wrapped her small arms around his neck. No fireworks exploded. No music played. But for Alexander, it was the loudest moment of his life. The silence was absolute, so thick it could have been sliced with a knife, yet so sacred it dared not be touched. Alexander's arms remained outstretched, not wide and theatrical, but open in a gesture both cautious and deeply vulnerable, as if he knew he had no right to ask for her forgiveness, but was offering a space where she could find safety anyway. For a single heartbeat, time froze. Nadia didn't move. Her small frame stood tense, almost in disbelief, as if this moment were a dream she had feared might never come true. Her lips trembled, her eyes wide and glossy with emotion too vast for words. And then, without warning, without restraint, she burst forward. A sob escaped her lips, sharp and raw like something too long held inside, and she ran barefoot, trembling, gasping, straight into his chest. She collided with him, not like a child embracing her father, but like someone who had been holding the weight of the world alone for far too long and had finally found a place to put it down. Her arms flung around his neck, desperate and shaking, and as his arms instinctively wrapped around her, everything else, the cameras, the gasps, the scandal, the halted wedding fell away. Nadia buried her face in his chest and cried, not polite, composed tears, but the kind that cracked through years of silence and loneliness and wondering. Each sob that racked her tiny frame was like a sentence she'd never been allowed to say. Where were you? Did you think about me? Did I matter? And in turn, Alexander held her, not with answers, but with presence. His hand cradled the back of her head, his cheek pressed to her hair. And for the first time in his life, he didn't care who was watching. He didn't care that powerful people were whispering in disbelief, or that shareholders might panic, or that Rachel stood frozen behind him with her future unraveling. All he knew was that the girl in his arms was real, and for reasons he didn't fully understand yet, she had chosen him. She had found him. She had forgiven him enough to want to be held. And so he held her like a man drowning who had just touched shore. He didn't speak. He couldn't. But in his silence there was more meaning than 1,000 apologies. Around them, people watched through tears, through awe, through something they couldn't name. Because what they were witnessing was not a scene of drama or scandal. It was the moment a man's heart broke and rebuilt itself in the shape of a daughter's arms. It was the moment when a little girl who had once been left behind had finally been held, like she'd always mattered. Across the grand hall, a hush fell deeper than any prayer, more profound than any vow, spoken moments earlier, under the wedding arch. It was as if the air itself had thickened with emotion, and every guest, executives in tailored suits, socialites in designer gowns, investors, distant cousins, longtime colleagues, found themselves unable to look away from the raw, unscripted moment unfolding before them. No one had planned for this, but somehow it felt more sacred than the ceremony they had come to witness. A few gasps had been audible when the girl had first spoken, but now there was only stillness. And then, like a quiet ripple breaking through silence, A soft sniffle emerged from the third row, where an elderly woman clutched a silk handkerchief to her mouth, her eyes glassy with tears she hadn't expected to shed. Just behind her, a young intern barely 20 seated among the overflow guests, let tears roll freely down her cheeks. Unmoved by decorum, struck by something primal and beautiful she didn't have words for. The head of a major media firm, a man known for his ruthless composure, had his hand pressed to his lips, his eyes locked on the child, clinging to Alexander's chest, and in that instant, no stock market, no quarterly profit, no polished press release seemed to matter at all. Murmurs began to swell gently, not gossip, but quiet reverence. Some guests reached instinctively for tissues, others placed hands on their hearts. One of the bridesmaids, Rachel's cousin, previously distracted by a phone tucked under her bouquet, now stood frozen mascara trailing silently down her cheeks, the phone forgotten as her gaze softened into something unguarded and human. Even the musicians who had been poised to resume with a cheerful classical overture found themselves unable to lift their bows, their instruments lowered as they watched with wide, stunned eyes. What they were witnessing wasn't a scandal or a disruption. It was something purer, something that broke through the carefully curated perfection of the event and replaced it with truth. A child had entered the room and shattered the illusion of control, and in her heartbreak, she had made every adult remember something they had buried: the ache of being forgotten, the longing to be chosen, the deep, wordless desire for a place to belong. And now seeing Alexander, once a symbol of power and detachment, kneeling arms wrapped around a child he never knew, transformed into something unrecognizably tender, they found themselves changed too. It was not pity that filled the room, nor shock, but a kind of collective reckoning. Every person in the hall, whether parent or not, whether believer in love or skeptic of it, felt the weight of what it meant to be seen, to be claimed, to be loved, despite everything. The applause never came. No one clapped because it would have cheapened the moment. Instead, there was just silence and tears and the sound of one little girl breathing into her father's chest, as if this embrace were the only thing that had ever mattered. Rachel stood frozen beneath the gilded archway that only moments ago had framed her as the center of everything: CEO, bride, perfect partner, the woman who had it all. But now, everything she had so meticulously built, timed, arranged down to the color of the orchids and the angle of the champagne tower, was crumbling in slow motion before her eyes. The applause that should have followed the vows, the glances of envy from guests, the polished smiles exchanged with high-ranking allies, all of it had dissolved into the background, eclipsed by a barefoot girl in a white dress, and the man Rachel was supposed to be marrying now on his knees, holding that girl like nothing else in the world existed. Rachel couldn't move. She couldn't blink. Her body stood upright, still poised in bridal elegance, but inside her, everything was cracking like glass under pressure. Hairline fractures racing outward from a truth she could no longer contain. She had spent a decade calculating each move, climbing every rung, silencing every distraction that threatened to derail her rise, and Nadia had always been part of that equation, neatly tucked away, managed, controlled. Rachel had told herself it was a temporary sacrifice, that when the time was right, when she was strong enough, stable enough, powerful enough, she would reclaim her daughter and rewrite the narrative. But she had waited too long. And now Nadia wasn't asking to be reclaimed. She had come to claim someone else. Rachel watched as the child she once bore trembled in the arms of the man she never wanted to tell, and something inside her slipped loose. This was not part of the script. The man who had once belonged wholly to her ambitions was now no longer hers, not truly. He didn't look at her with rage or accusation. Worse, he wasn't looking at her at all. His eyes were on Nadia, and they were softer than Rachel had ever seen them, more open than anything she'd been able to summon from him, even in the most intimate moments. Around her, the guests were no longer whispering admiration. Their eyes darted from Alexander to Nadia, and then to Rachel. And in those looks she saw the shift judgment blooming like mold in the corners of their expressions. They wondered what kind of woman could hide a daughter like that, What kind of mother could walk away? And though none of them said it aloud, Rachel could feel their questions scraping against her skin, cutting deeper than any words. She clenched her fists at her sides, the bouquet slipping slightly in her grip, the stems biting into her palm, grounding her to a reality she had no control over. The weight of the moment was suffocating, not because of shame, but because she had lost control of the narrative, and for a woman like Rachel that was worse than guilt. It was annihilation. She was no longer the protagonist of this story. The spotlight had shifted, the emotional center had changed, and the audience once hers had turned. She wasn't the radiant bride anymore. She was just a woman, watching the child she left behind find a home in the arms of the only man she thought she could outmaneuver. And in that stillness, Rachel realized with chilling clarity that some things once let go cannot be reclaimed. Not with power, not with timing, not with strategy. They have to be chosen. And she had never truly chosen Nadia. Alexander stepped slowly toward the center of the aisle, every pair of eyes in the room magnetized to his movements, as though the air had thickened and time itself had slowed to match his breath. The opulent silence inside the grand ballroom, just moments ago brimming with celebratory murmurs and clinking glasses, was now so complete it rang in his ears like static. In one hand he held Nadia's small, trembling fingers, still warm from their embrace. In the other, he reached for the microphone once reserved for toasts and declarations of eternal partnership, now repurposed for something entirely different, something raw and unscripted. As he stood beneath the vaulted ceiling surrounded by rose-draped chandeliers and 1,000 carefully curated expectations, he could feel the weight of truth pressing against the back of his throat. He glanced down at Nadia, who gave the smallest nod as if to say, "You can." That silent gesture emboldened him, more than a boardroom full of unanimous votes ever had. He raised the microphone to his lips. The velvet backdrop behind him, emblazoned with his and Rachel's initials in gold, suddenly felt like it belonged to another life, another man. "I know many of you came here today to witness a wedding." Alexander began, his voice steady but low, carrying the tremor of something breaking open. A celebration of love, of commitment, of carefully made promises. And for that I thank you. But I won't stand here and pretend that what just happened didn't change everything. He paused, scanning the crowd. Executives, investors, distant relatives, journalists already scribbling, and Rachel standing alone, framed by lace and stunned silence, watching him as if willing him to stop. He didn't. A little girl walked into this room with more courage than I've ever seen in my life. She didn't ask for gifts. She didn't demand acknowledgement or compensation. She asked a question that shattered the ceremony and rebuilt something infinitely more sacred in its place. He looked at Nadia again, his voice growing firmer. She asked if I remembered leaving someone behind, and the answer is, I didn't know. I truly didn't. But now that I do, I can't pretend my life before this moment was whole, because it wasn't, because she was missing. Murmurs rippled, but Alexander didn't flinch. I don't have the perfect words. I don't have a speech prepared, but I have a daughter. And right now, that is the only truth that matters. He paused, gripping the mic tighter. To those of you wondering what this means for the future, for the company, for my reputation, ask me tomorrow. Today, I'm not a CEO. I'm not a groom. I'm a father who just met his child for the first time, and I'm not going to let her walk away. The room was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not shocked, but reverent, as if the ceremony had ended and something more honest had just begun. Alexander stood beneath the glittering chandelier, the microphone still in his hand. But now his grip had loosened, his posture, no longer that of a poised executive or polished groom, but of a man stripped to his core. The ballroom, once filled with floral arrangements and curated perfection, now held its breath in collective suspense. He looked out, not at Rachel, not at the investors seated in the front row, not even at the watchful eyes of the press, but directly into the uncertain, soul-searching gaze of the little girl who had changed everything. And then, with a calm that belied the earthquake beneath his words, he spoke. I know what you all expect from me today. He began, his voice resonating through the silence like the first crack in glass. "You expect vows, a declaration, a perfect union followed by celebration. That was the plan, right?" He let the question hang as the crowd remained perfectly still. He turned slightly, eyes scanning the aisle, and then fixed on Rachel, who stood like a monument to disbelief. But something happened. Something I didn't plan for. Something real. And I owe all of you the truth, whether you want to hear it or not. He inhaled deeply. "I cannot get married today." A visible ripple went through the room. Gasp. Whisper. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to believe what they were hearing. "Not because I don't believe in love," he continued, eyes now shining with an emotion none of his board members had ever seen. "Not because I don't respect the commitment I was prepared to make, but because in the middle of all this grandeur, this ceremony, I found something I didn't know I had lost. Something greater than marriage. Something far more sacred than any deal or promise or name etched into invitations." His voice dropped just enough that it drew everyone closer in. "I found my daughter." The silence turned into a stunned, suspended awe. A few people covered their mouths. Others looked between Alexander and the small girl beside him as if trying to stitch together the pieces of an impossible puzzle. 10 years ago, Alexander said slowly, something happened between Rachel and me. I didn't know it had consequences. I didn't know a child came from it. But today that child walked into my life, into this room, and asked me a question no man should ever have to hear. "Did you forget me?" He shook his head slightly, pain flickering across his features. And in that moment, I knew there was no wedding grand enough, no partnership powerful enough to cover that wound. Because what kind of man would I be if I stepped into a marriage while ignoring the most sacred bond I just rediscovered? His voice cracked, not from weakness, but from raw, unfiltered truth. So no, I will not be saying, "I do," today. Because today, I am saying something else. Something that matters more. I am saying to this girl, this brave, extraordinary girl, who stood in a room full of strangers to ask if she mattered, I'm saying yes. Yes, you matter. You are not forgotten. You are not invisible. You are not a mistake swept under some corporate rug. He took one step closer to Nadia, kneeling again, offering her the microphone as if to pass the voice to where it belonged. Then he looked back at the crowd. I cannot marry today because I just found something more important than marriage. I found my daughter, and I will not let her go again. Rachel stood frozen at the edge of the aisle, her white gown catching the soft glow of the overhead lights like a net made of illusion. The room had erupted in stunned whispers, but she heard none of them. Not the hushed gasps of shareholders, not the confused murmurs of relatives, or the nervous cough of the wedding planner pacing near the curtain. What she heard instead was silence, dense, personal, unforgiving. It wrapped around her like a suffocating veil, heavier than the dress she had spent weeks choosing. The weight of her curated world, of every deal, every calculated charm, every move on the chessboard of public perception, was crumbling beneath her feet. She didn't look at Alexander. She couldn't. Not after his words. Not after he had stood in front of everyone and unraveled a truth she thought she had buried well enough to outlast time. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He simply chose the girl. And in doing so, unchose Rachel. Not with malice, but with clarity so sharp it pierced through years of ambition. Her fingers slowly loosened from the bouquet she held as if her body instinctively knew what her mind hadn't yet said out loud. This was over. Not just the wedding, the image, the control. She turned not dramatically, not with a speech, but with the quiet decisiveness of someone whose kingdom had just been reclaimed by reality. Her heels made no sound against the carpeted aisle as she walked head high, eyes dry, not because she wasn't shattered, but because she wouldn't let anyone see it. Not yet. Not here. A few guests attempted to make eye contact, but Rachel looked past them, through them, as though their sympathy was too costly to accept. Cameras remained respectfully still, unsure whether this was still part of the show. But this wasn't a show anymore. This was a reckoning. She reached the grand exit of the ballroom where moments ago she had imagined stepping into a new era with Alexander by her side, her name further secured by power and proximity. But now it felt like crossing a threshold into exile. She didn't rush. Rachel moved with the poise of someone who knew how to leave a room with dignity, even as it burned down behind her. Her mind spiraled, replaying every choice, hiding the pregnancy, disappearing after Nadia's birth, returning years later to rekindle something she thought could be salvaged, believing that time and narrative control could erase what she had done. But now the consequences stood 10 years old, brown-eyed, and wrapped in the arms of the man Rachel had hoped would never learn the truth. She had underestimated them both. The girl's courage, Alexander's moral line. She had overestimated the power of silence and secrets. And so Rachel exited, leaving behind not only a wedding, but the center of a story that no longer belonged to her. 1 week later, a quiet moment captured on a phone camera in Central Park became the most unexpected viral video of the season, not for its drama, but for its disarming tenderness. There was no stage, no microphone, no polished suit or cascading gown. Just a man in a simple button-down shirt and sneakers, carrying a small girl on his back, walking slowly beneath the late afternoon sun. The caption read, "Is this the CEO from that wedding?" But the tone of the video made it feel more like a memory than a spectacle. Leaves fluttered overhead, catching golden light while ducks drifted across the nearby lake. The man Alexander Prescott, known across headlines as the groom who walked away from a multi-million-dollar wedding, looked nothing like a scandal or a corporate giant. He looked like a father. His steps were unhurried, his posture relaxed, despite the girl's weight on his back. She had her arms loosely wrapped around his neck, her cheek resting against his shoulder, as if she had always belonged there. Her name was Nadia, and for the people who knew the story, who had followed the public unraveling of one of the most anticipated society weddings of the year, this moment felt like the quiet postscript no one had expected, but everyone needed. The video didn't begin with a dramatic entrance or declaration. It began mid-conversation as the unseen person filming caught them at the perfect moment. Nadia's voice was soft, thoughtful, almost hesitant. "Do you ever wish you had married her?" She didn't ask with bitterness or insecurity, only the raw curiosity of a child trying to understand how the world chooses what matters. There was a pause, brief but deep. Alexander tilted his head slightly, glancing up at the canopy above them, as if looking for the right words in the rustling leaves. Then he smiled. Not the press smile, not the executive grin, but the kind that softened everything, that revealed years of exhaustion he hadn't realized he'd carried until they melted in the presence of this girl. "No," he said gently. "I don't wish I had married her." He took 2 more steps, then added with quiet conviction, "The only thing I regret is not finding you sooner." Nadia didn't say anything at first. She just closed her eyes, tightening her arms around his neck ever so slightly, the kind of embrace that says more than any words could. The video ended there, fading out on that single frame, a father walking forward, a daughter held close, the world falling away behind them. No boardrooms, no headlines, just breath and gravel and sunlight. In the comments, people wrote things like, "This is what love looks like, and he chose right." For some, it was a redemption story. For others, a reminder of what truly matters. But for Alexander and Nadia, it wasn't a statement or a spectacle. It was simply a walk in the park. And for the first time in both their lives, it felt like home. In life, we often chase after titles, appearances, and grand milestones, careers, weddings, reputations, believing they define our worth. But as Alexander Prescott learned, the most important things aren't always the ones we plan or announce. They're the quiet moments, the unexpected child showing up with your eyes and your stubbornness, the whispered question in a park, the arms around your neck when you thought you had no one left to carry. This story reminds us that redemption doesn't come from doing things perfectly. It comes from showing up even if late. You might not be able to rewrite the past, but you can choose how you show up in someone's future. Forgiveness takes courage, and so does presence. Sometimes a single "I'm here now" means more than 1,000 apologies. And for every parent who's made mistakes, for every child who has questions, for anyone who's ever felt forgotten or unsure if they matter, this is a reminder. Love doesn't always arrive on time, but when it does, let it in. If this story touched you, take a moment to reflect who in your life needs to hear "I'm here now." Who deserves a second chance? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Save this video if it meant something to you, and don't forget to follow or subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart. Sometimes all it takes is one moment to change everything. Let's keep reminding each other of what truly matters.